Thank you so much, Mabel. It's an honor to be able to be with you tonight. So, who was Charlotte Hazen Atlee White Rowe? How did this person who was born and was buried in Lancaster become a significant figure in women's history, as well as in mission and religious studies, and why has she been so largely unknown? Charlotte Hazen Atlee was born in Lancaster to Esther Bowes Sayer and her husband, William Augustus Atlee, in 1782 at the end of the American Revolutionary War. Family was middle class. Mr. Atlee was a lawyer who became a Pennsylvania Supreme Court judge. The Atlee home, shown here, was located on the northwest corner of Duke and Orange Streets, just across from St. James Episcopal Church, where Judge Atlee was a longtime warden. The home was described as, quote, the resort of the beauty and intelligence of the surrounding country. Charlotte was the youngest of 11 children, 3 of whom had died by the time of Charlotte's birth. Although we don't know the details, it's evident that Charlotte received a good education. The children may have used this family prayer book of morning and evening prayers that was created by their pastor, the Reverend William Barton, and printed by the Baptist monks at Ephrata Cloister. Reverend Barton based his book on the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Charlotte's pleasant childhood in Lancaster was ruptured by 2 sorrowful events. 1 week before her 8th birthday, her mother died. 3 years later, her father died. The 2 deaths left Charlotte an 11-year-old orphan. Charlotte was sent to Rutland, Massachusetts, into the home of her oldest sister, Elizabeth Atlee, the wife of Major Moses White. Elizabeth was 17 years older than Charlotte and already the mother of 4 children when Charlotte joined the family. Charlotte lived her adolescence and early adulthood in Rutland. There she met Major White's younger half-brother, Nathaniel Hazen White, who was a Rutland merchant. In 1803, Rutland's Congregationalist minister pronounced the 21-year-old Charlotte Atlee and the 29-year-old Nathaniel White to be husband and wife. A year later, the Whites welcomed a newborn son. They gave him his father's name, Nathaniel Hazen White. But once again, 2 unexpected deaths shattered her world. On Christmas Day, 1804, her husband, Nathaniel White, died. 5 months later, their 9-month-old baby boy died. The father and son were laid to rest in Rutland's old burial ground. Charlotte was now widowed and childless. In the midst of that dual trauma, Charlotte moved 60 miles away to Haverhill, Massachusetts, on the north bank of the Merrimack River, where she lived with her husband's relatives. In Haverhill, Charlotte met the Baptists. There she experienced spiritual renewal and joined the Baptist Church and was baptized in the Merrimack River. Her baptism was described by Leverett Saltonstall, a friend of her brother-in-law, Daniel Appleton White, whose law office was located near the Haverhill Bridge. Saltonstall was a Congregationalist who occasionally attended Baptist worship services and who described baptism by immersion as plunging. Not infrequently, identical actions by men and women are judged differently. That happened on this occasion. Although Saltonstall had witnessed plungings before, Charlotte's baptism caught him by surprise. For as Charlotte waded into the water to be baptized, she began to sing. As Saltonstall described it in his journal, Mrs. W., just before she was plunged, struck up a verse. He was taken aback by Charlotte's spontaneous singing, and he wrote, I was sorry for it. It was unusual and unnecessary. And however sincere she might have been, it seemed very like ostentation. Rather than hearing Charlotte's song as an extemporaneous expression of sincere spirituality, Saltonstall credited it to her personality. She had a very romantic disposition, he wrote in his journal, which I presume is not changed, but only directed to religion. Until the end of the Revolutionary War, all the pastors at St. James, Charlotte's home church, had been missionary priests appointed by the Church of England's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Charlotte's uncle, the Reverend John Sayer, had been an SPG missionary who served in New York. In Haverhill, Charlotte encountered much activity in support of foreign mission. The Baptist Church, for instance, solicited funds from its members and the general public for the translation and printing of scripture into the languages of India and China, work that was being done by William Carey and other British Baptist missionaries in India. The Reverend William Batchelder, pastor of the Haverhill Baptist Church, was head of the India and Foreign Missionary Society of Haverhill and the vicinity. Charlotte would also have heard about Harriet Atwood of Haverhill and Anne, or Nancy Hazeltine, of the neighboring town of Bradford, just across the Merrimack River. The two young women had accepted marriage proposals and would be sailing to India with their husbands. Notice here that the newspaper announcement of the weddings identified the husbands as the missionaries, but not the wives. In the midst of this mission-related activity, Charlotte also discerned a call to missionary service herself. She moved from Haverhill to Philadelphia, where she joined the Sansom Street Baptist Church. That church had a distinctive round shape and had a circular-shaped baptistry in the center of the sanctuary. Its pastor, the Reverend William Stoughton, had come from England, where he had helped form the Baptist Mission Society in England, had helped send William Carey as the first Baptist missionary to India, and regularly corresponded with Carey and other British Baptist missionaries in India. In 1814, Stoughton became the founding head of the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions. The board immediately appointed its first missionary, the Reverend Adoniram Judson, who had become a Baptist and was in Burma translating the Bible into Burmese. The board did not appoint Judson's wife, Anne, who was also working in Burma. Charlotte helped to form and lead the Sansom Street Baptist Female Society for the propagation of evangelical missions. 1 year later, she applied to the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions, and in June 1815, the board voted her appointment, making her the first woman in America to be officially appointed as an international cross-cultural missionary. Charlotte's appointment, however, was highly controversial. Although other women had preceded Charlotte into mission service, none of them were appointed. All had been regarded as volunteer assistants to male missionaries. No denomination or mission agency in America had ever appointed a woman. In the late 1700s and increasingly through the 1800s, most Americans expected women to confine their activities to the domestic sphere of home, family, church, and social visits, while men pursued the engagement in the public sphere of industry, commerce, medicine, law, and politics. The ideology of separate spheres was intentionally promoted and written into law. For instance, the English jurist Sir William Blackstone, in his commentaries on the laws of England, had famously stated, quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage." This view in English common law continued to echo in American law. In 1872, for instance, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley stated, "The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The Constitution of the Family Organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere is that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. It is true, he went on to write, that many women are unmarried and not affected by any of the duties, complications, and incapacities arising out of the married state, but these are exceptions to the general rule. And the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things and cannot be based upon exceptional cases. Separate spheres was a social ideology supported by law. This social context heightened the distinction between appointing a missionary and sending one. Appointment had organizational significance. It made Charlotte an agent of the sending body and established mutual accountability between her and the board. It also had spiritual significance that bore similarity to a pastor's ordination. The presupposition that missionary appointment was in the public sphere meant that it was not a role for woman. It was not a role for Mrs. Charlotte H. White. At least one of the members of the Baptist board held this view. He was the Reverend Henry Holcomb, pastor of the prestigious First Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Holcomb had earlier written a circular letter to a church association about the proper role of women in the church. Holcomb held that women were inferior in some respects to men. Man, he said, was created in the image of God, not women. Women should never assume any role in the church that usurped the authority of man. Holcomb voted against appointing Charlotte as a missionary because she was not an ordained man. Women in the church, said Reverend Holcomb, were helpful and ornamental. The problem for Holcomb, however, was that the board's constitution used the word missionary but did not define it. The Jesuits had coined the word in the 1500s, but the board's constitution did not stipulate what a missionary was. Holcomb's attempt to revoke Charlotte's appointment failed. Although Charlotte had been legally appointed, several members questioned whether the board had sufficient funds to send her. Charlotte may have anticipated that objection, for she had a modest estate. Whether from her deceased parents or her deceased husband or both, we don't know. But Charlotte donated money from her estate to the board on the condition that they would use that money for her own expenses. For the next decade, Charlotte would fund her mission work herself. Charlotte sailed to India with another newly appointed missionary, the Reverend George Howe. The Judsons in Burma had now translated portion of the Bible into Burmese and needed someone who could print the material so it could be distributed. George Howe had those skills, for he had been a printer before he became a pastor. Charlotte accompanied George, his wife Phoebe, and their 2 children as they all sailed to Calcutta, India. The journey to Calcutta took 4 months. After arriving in April of 1816, they proceeded up the river to Serampore. There they met William Carey and the British Baptist missionaries who worked with him. The Serampore missionaries had a printing press that they were donating for the work of the Judsons in Burma. That is why Charlotte's ship stopped in Calcutta rather than going directly to Rangoon, Burma. On board the ship, Charlotte had begun keeping a journal. She would periodically send sheets of the journal to her brother, Dr. Edwin Augustus Atlee, in Philadelphia, where they would later be bound together in book form. Charlotte used the pen name Onesta. I might add that Charlotte's journal is preserved in the Yale Divinity School library and has only recently been located by myself and others. Charlotte recorded her thoughts and experiences, such as her visit to see the Hindu god Juggernaut when it was taken from its temple and moved about in an elaborate multi-storied car. While staying at Serampore, Charlotte met the Reverend Joshua Rowe, a British Baptist missionary whose wife had died several years earlier, leaving him with 3 young sons. It took 2 months to find a ship that could take the Americans and the printing press and the type from Calcutta to Rangoon. By that time, Charlotte White and Joshua Rowe had become husband and wife. The wedding ceremony took place at St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Calcutta. St. John's was an imposing church building that had been constructed by the East India Company. Now, it's hard for us to comprehend the power of the East India Company. This private commercial enterprise had earned stunning profits by shipping spices from Asia to India. The company then diversified into anything else that would yield profit for its stockholders, including cotton, tea, saltpeter, silk, salt, coffee, and eventually opium. Queen Elizabeth I gave the company a 15-year monopoly on trade between England and India. Her successor, King James I, made the monopoly indefinite. Its growing wealth and influence led the company to call itself, quote, the grandest society of merchants in the universe. It grew to have its own army and navy, coined its own currency, created its own laws, established its presence in India either with the consent or conquest of local rulers, and administered colonial rule in India on behalf of the crown. Charlotte and Joshua Rowe traveled up the Ganges River some 360 miles northwest of Serampore to Digha, a village of some 500 homes located directly on the bank of the Ganges. 10 miles to the east of Digha stood the ancient city of Patna, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Patna had become a major commercial center through which the East India Company shipped its goods. Just 1 mile to the west of Digha was the city of Dinapur, where a large cantonment was located. Sometimes companies of His Majesty's troops were stationed at the military encampment, but more often the soldiers were from the Honorable Company. The Baptist Mission was located on the bank of the Ganges, and Charlotte drew this map of the property showing the 2 square bungalows in the center. To the north, a smaller bungalow on the right, to the north of the smaller bungalow on the right lay a circular garden leading to a terrace overlooking the river. The upper portion of the map shows how the Ganges was steadily eroding the bank. By the time Charlotte had arrived, a 3rd bungalow had already collapsed into the river. In the Rose bungalow, something smaller than this illustrative one, Charlotte learned to read and write Hindi. She began her work as an educator by teaching English language students who were boarding in their house. But as her fluency in Hindi increased, she began starting Hindi language schools in nearby communities. Some of the school buildings were mud huts. Lacking any published teaching materials, Charlotte began creating her own. She wrote a Hindi spelling book and a Hindi grammar that the Calcutta School Book Society printed for her, and likewise sold to other schools as educational tools. Her spelling book was in the Nagri script, which had its origins in Sanskrit, although Charlotte also learned to read Hindi in the Persian script, which is cursive with Arabic influence. Charlotte advocated for the education of girls as well as boys. She started coeducational schools and several girls' schools. She hired men to teach the boys' schools, but women teachers were relatively rare. As a result, she taught some adult women and recruited those with the needed skills to be teachers for the girls' schools. This, however, aroused controversy, for she was teaching Indian children to read and to read their own language. The powerful East India Company feared that an educated populace could imperil colonial rule and the company's profits. A company director argued that England had lost the American colonies, in part because of allowing schools and universities to start in America. Such folly, he warned, should not be repeated in India. Some local people were also wary of education, especially for girls. In one community, the girls fled their school when a rumor was circulated that as soon as the girls had received a proper education, they would be kidnapped, tied up in bags, and shipped off to England. Despite opposition from many sources, Charlotte persisted. She continued starting schools and financed them by raising subscriptions for those purposes. To gain support, she needed to convince potential donors that girls, as well as boys, could learn and could benefit from education. So she offered proof. She invited a select group of European expatriates to witness a public examination of her students. Charlotte knew that without seeing it for themselves, many expatriates would not believe that such a school existed, much less be convinced of their utility. All of her invited guests were impressed that 55 girls and 159 boys were under her instruction. Determined that children deserved better learning conditions, Charlotte resolved to replace the inadequate schoolhouses with healthier buildings. While brick school buildings endured longer, those made of bamboo and grass were less expensive and provided better ventilation and more light for the students. As Charlotte solicited funds from the expatriate community, she again encountered resistance. Some were willing to loan money if she used it for her own personal needs, but most believed that local children didn't need schools. They're better left off as they are, she was told. But Charlotte was undeterred. She continued reaching out to find individuals who would endorse her vision and would provide funding. Charlotte often was carried in a palanquin to oversee the schools that she had started, or to negotiate with local landlords to secure rent-free locations for her schools. The schools around Diga, however, were on flat and poorly drained land that was subject to significant flooding during the rainy season. The school building at one village was a mud hut, so small, dark, and crowded that it was quite disgustful. In the dry season, the yard was crowded with feeding cattle that filled the hut with suffocating animal fumes. When Charlotte visited the school following the rains, the condition was even worse. The yard overflowed with muddy water. Men had to wade waist deep to carry Charlotte to the hut's door, where she entered with difficulty. 35 boys and 10 girls awaited her inside that hut. Now, these palanquins were used both by European expatriates and local Indians. Charlotte, however, disliked them. She felt that this mode of transportation was degrading to the men who were the bearers. When she was able to afford it, therefore, Charlotte dispensed with her palanquin and purchased a small horse and cart. When Reverend Joshua Rowe had been in Calcutta before their marriage, he had learned and preached in Bengali. At Diga, however, he never became fluent in Hindi and needed a translator. As a result, he worked among English-speaking people, most of whom were soldiers or employees of the East India Company. He preached regularly at the cantonment in Dinapur, where a congregation was formed among the soldiers. At first, the soldiers erected a chapel behind the barracks, which, like the schools, was made out of grass and bamboo. They called the little chapel the Grass Tabernacle. When that building became too small, the soldiers tore it down and replaced it with this brick building that still stands on the cantonment today. Charlotte and Joshua worked together for 7 years. He as that English-speaking pastor and she as the Hindi-speaking educator. During that time, Charlotte gave birth to 2 twin daughters, Esther Anna Rowe, named after Charlotte's mother, Esther Atlee, and Charlotte Elizabeth Rowe, named after Charlotte herself. Then in 1823, Charlotte and Joshua had a son named Edwin Atlee Rowe, after Charlotte's beloved brother, with whom she felt particularly close and to whom she was sending letters and pages of her journal. While contending with controversies and challenges related to education, Charlotte had to withstand a new struggle. Although controversy over Charlotte's appointment had faded in Philadelphia, a new scandal had erupted. Charlotte had shared private thoughts in letters to her brother, Edwin Augustus Atlee, Philadelphia physician. Without her knowledge or permission, Dr. Atlee had shown one of her letters to the religious visionary Theophilus Ransom Gates, editor of The Reformer, a radical monthly Philadelphia newspaper. Gates rejected all forms of organized religion, including mission societies, and he published his paper to advance his views. He had already accused the British missionaries in Serampore of stealing from their mission society. He now printed an anonymous extract drawn from Charlotte's letter that he felt supported that claim. Then in a subsequent issue, he named Charlotte Rowe as his source. When the controversy became known in London, the Baptist Missionary Society sent a letter of reprimand to the Rowes in India. Charlotte was astounded that her confidential correspondence had been repurposed for anti-missionary propaganda. Now, she was too far away to defend herself in the Philadelphia press, but she did not lack agency. Stunned by her brother Edwin's arrogant attitude and actions, Charlotte renamed her baby. From that time on, her son would be named Judson Ward Rowe. Rather than look to his uncle Edwin, Charlotte encouraged him to emulate her fellow missionaries, the courageous Adoniram Judson, who was laboring in Burma, and the warm-hearted William Ward, who had died of cholera in Serampore a month before little Judson's birth. Joshua Rowe died later that year, 1823. He was buried in the cantonment cemetery shown here, which is now overtaken by jungle vegetation. Charlotte was now the single parent of 6 children. For the next 3 years, she worked at Diga without assistance from any missionary colleagues. She alone managed the mission. She supervised 10 schools, taught, organized the construction and repair of school and mission buildings, led the Hindi language church at Diga, oversaw the ministries of indigenous evangelists who called her their pastoress. As her philosophy and practice of mission matured, she adapted to the local culture, critiqued the role of money in missions, and challenged the system in which new missionaries were taught Hindi by people in India, for whom it was a second language, rather than by local people in India whose mother tongue was Hindi. Charlotte also bore the burden of writing and mailing reports to the Baptist Missionary Society in London. In 1826, the London office informed Charlotte that hereafter she would have to bear the cost of maintaining the mission buildings in Diga out of her own resources. That extra expense threw Charlotte's finances off balance. Her careful efforts at self-support were now unsustainable. She knew that the mission could successfully be financed and strengthened if the society would appoint her, give her a modest salary, and send 2 new missionary couples to work alongside her at Diga. Now, no road existed between Diga and Calcutta. Charlotte's journal reveals that letters were carried in relay by men running on a footpath 5 to 10 miles, then transferring the padlocked leather bags of letters to the next man in succession until the mail finally reached the port of Calcutta. But Charlotte simply could not negotiate with the Mission Society through letters that would take 5 to 6 months to travel from Diga to London, while she remained in India accumulating debt while she was awaiting a clear response. So she began to plan a voyage to England. She would bring her twins, her son, and 2 other missionary children. Charlotte had always taken great pains to pay all personal expenses from her own resources to assure the society that its money was used exclusively for mission purposes. And although the trip to England clearly served the needs of the mission, Charlotte did not leave until she could travel without costing the society any expense. Even in this, she paid her own way. Charlotte left Diga in November of 1826 in a budgerow, one of the cumbersome rudderless river barges that plied the Ganges, that was operated by a crew of 8 boatmen and 2 servants. Their shelter on the barge consisted of a room constructed of mats with a thatched roof. The budgerow floated down the river during the day and moored along the shore at night. Just north of Calcutta, Charlotte came upon a sight that seared itself into her memory. There at the river's edge lay a man's corpse, with its feet touching the Ganges' holy water and its head cradled in the widow's lap. Charlotte was taken aback as she watched men preparing a funeral pyre, two young children standing beside the widow, and other women prompting the widow to throw herself on her husband's burning corpse to die. Charlotte ordered her oarsman to stop. She spoke to the widow in Hindi, appealing to her to save herself for the sake of her children and grandchildren. The boatman on the Budgeroo joined Charlotte in urging the widow to refrain from killing herself, saying that the missionaries would provide for her if she came along with Charlotte. By this time, the crowd had grown boisterous. Charlotte could not bear to watch the widow burn herself alive, so she asked the boatman to push back and continue down the river. Later, she learned that the woman had thrown herself into the fire. Nevertheless, Charlotte had not simply passed by. She had not remained silent. Even in her final hours in India, she had offered herself as an instrument to do what she could. When Charlotte finally reached London, she discovered that the Baptist Missionary Society was unwilling to appoint her and give her a modest salary. Gender bias was as strong in England as in America. Appointing a woman would stir as much controversy in London as it had in Philadelphia. When the London Society held its Jubilee meeting 15 years later, one of the speakers addressed the women in the audience by saying, "Ladies, it is not yours to be supreme. It is ours. It is yours to obey. But though it is ours to be supreme, yet it is a supremacy in which there is to be nothing capricious, nothing tyrannical. You are not to be our drudges today and our toys tomorrow. You are our companions. You are our helpmates." Charlotte settled for a time in Yeovil, England, and over the next 3 years gathered finances. In 1829, she returned to the United States with her twin daughters and young son, while the 3 older stepsons remained in jobs and apprenticeships in India. Her work in India was now over. Back in Philadelphia, Charlotte rented a house and opened a small girls' school in her home. While teaching and caring for her family, she also wrote newspaper articles about her experiences in India. As with her journal, Charlotte wrote her articles using the pen name Onesta. 4 years later, she moved her family to the south, from Philadelphia to the small Alabama community of Lancaster, where she and her 17-year-old daughter, Charlotte Elizabeth, taught at an academy. The Lancaster Academy was originally coeducational and only later reorganized into a separate boys' academy and female seminary. The move from one of the largest cities in the United States to the small Alabama town may have been for the sake of her son's health. Little Judson Ward Rowe had almost died from illness in India, and Philadelphia winters may have been problematic for a child accustomed to a warmer climate. No record of her son has been found following the family's move to Alabama. Charlotte's journal testifies to her abhorrence of slavery. And if her son was now deceased, she would no longer have needed to remain in the South. A diary written by one of Charlotte's nieces provides evidence that Charlotte and her 2 daughters had left Alabama and returned to Pennsylvania by 1846. By 1850, Charlotte and her daughters had settled in Strasburg, 8 miles southeast of her early childhood home in Lancaster. Strasburg's identity as a cultural and educational center far exceeded anything that Charlotte had found in Alabama. The 1800s had brought on a flood of schools in Strasburg. Ads for the Strasburg Academy appeared in newspapers from Lancaster and Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. The principal also made visits to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. to recruit students. The Academy's growing reputation attracted students from other states as well, and also from Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Strasburg Female Seminary opened in 1841 to offer classical education for girls. By 1845, the seminary had 20 students. The boys' academy and the girls' seminary complemented each other by making it possible for families with sons and daughters to send them together for education in Strasbourg. The seminary operated out of this building that still stands in Strasbourg. The seminary, however, struggled to maintain sufficient enrollment and closed in the late 1840s. That created the need to find a new principal who could revive the school. It's unclear how leaders in Strasbourg became acquainted with Charlotte Rowe. Charlotte did not seek fame and was not then publicly known for being the first American woman to be appointed as a missionary. However, in 1849, the academy included some boys from Alabama. Charlotte may have sought out the school after returning to Pennsylvania, or she may have become known through the academy's ties to those Alabama families. Charlotte was then 67 and had significant administrative and teaching experience, especially her substantial accomplishments of starting and supervising schools in India. Since Charlotte's twin daughters accompanied her from Alabama to Strasbourg, her daughter Charlotte Elizabeth, then 31 years old, was employed as an assistant teacher when Charlotte became the seminary's new principal. The remaining twin, Esther Anna, suffered from very poor health resulting from a near-death illness in India. And although Sissy had enjoyed reading as a child, her eyesight was extremely weak. In the midst of the rejuvenating reopening of the Strasbourg Female Seminary, Charlotte's life was shaken once again by two deaths that occurred in rapid succession. In March 1851, her daughter Esther died unmarried at age 32. Charlotte brought Esther's body to Lancaster for burial in the St. James Cemetery near the graves of her grandparents. Charlotte's sorrow was repeated the following year in October 1852 with the death of her remaining daughter and co-teacher, Charlotte Elizabeth. Also unmarried, Charlotte Elizabeth died one day before her 34th birthday. She also was buried in St. James Cemetery next to her twin sister. A single headstone marks the twins' graves. By 1853, Charlotte had returned to Philadelphia, where she lived her final years. In 1863, Charlotte died in Germantown at age 81. Like her first husband, Nathaniel Hazen White, Charlotte died on Christmas Day. She was taken to Lancaster, and her funeral was held 2 days later at St. James Episcopal Church. Charlotte's notable significance as America's first appointed woman missionary was long overlooked and omitted from written accounts. Rather than acknowledge her as a missionary, most accounts defined her as the wife of a missionary. Even during the 3 years that she worked alone in India, the London office referred to the Digha mission station as vacant. In India, as well as in Pennsylvania and Alabama, her work as an educator faded from public memory. The woman who had dared to open the door for women to be appointed as missionaries equally with men was buried next to her twin daughters in St. James Cemetery in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the Civil War, in an unmarked grave. Thank you.
All right, we have some time for questions. So if anybody has one, they can raise their hand and I'll walk over. Yeah.
Is her grave still unmarked?
As of today, the grave is still unmarked. However, the St. James congregation has warmly embraced Charlotte, this daughter of the church. And a project is underway to have her grave appropriately marked, including potentially a bronze marker that will also give more details about her significance beyond the mere vital statistics.
How did you get interested in this line of research?
I was going to ask a similar question. I know you've been a missionary. How did you get interested in the work of the history of the mission, and how has it informed your practice?
Well, it's a very good question. I had been associated in various capacities with the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, now called International Ministries, which was the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions that appointed Charlotte. I'd been involved for about 3 decades with the organization and never knew about Charlotte. It was only in 2014, when the society celebrated its 200th anniversary, I was doing some additional work in our archives, and I noticed something that I had not noticed before. Baptists always refer to Ann and Adoniram Judson, the first missionaries. I'd always presumed they were both appointed. And I noticed the detail that only Adoniram was appointed, Ann was not. And then I began noticing that other women, none of them were appointed. Adoniram was appointed in 1814, and then I saw in the record the very next year, 1815, is the name of Mrs. Charlotte H. White, appointed. And she's appointed for work in Burma to work alongside the Judsons. Now, by this time, I did a little more study. I looked at the Congregationalist records. Had they appointed Anne or Harriet Newell when the Judsons and Newells? No one, no denomination, no mission agency was appointing women. So I thought, how come she got appointed by the Baptists? And if she was appointed, how come I don't see any record of her in Burma? Did she ever serve as a missionary? If she did, where did she serve? What did she do? And those kinds of questions led to my thirst for studying her life.
And how do you think that's gone on to inform your work, or can inform the work of other missionaries doing this work today?
Well, one of the things that is an important value for me is the equal treatment of persons regardless of gender. Charlotte really did crack the door open to the appointment of women. It really would take another 98 years before the board finally settled a policy that women would be equally appointed along with their husbands, and single women would be fully appointed. So it was a long process. And to me, it has been important to not only have those kinds of core commitments, but also to demonstrate them in one's practice. For instance, the agency which had appointed Charlotte, today, when missionaries are listed and couples are listed, sometimes there will be Bill and I'm creating some names now. Bill and Mary Jones. Or there may be a Anne and Frederick Jones. Now, do you catch the difference? Bill and Mary, Anne and Frederick. Rather than just assuming that when you name a couple, you always put the man's name first, this agency has decided, as one tiny indication, let's list people by their name, first of all, and list the names in alphabetical order. For many years, missionary couples, you would only have, there's the Reverend George Howe and wife. The name wouldn't even appear. So it's important in working in other cultures, much less our own, to live out in as many ways as possible the values that one has. It's always been a joy to me to bring with me, when I've traveled to a number of countries in Asia or Africa, to bring with me ordained women and to be able to introduce, this is Reverend Sally so-and-so. It was a special joy when I was able to bring my pastor, Reverend Karen Seelig, in a visit to Nagaland. And just the fact of having her with me and introducing her as my pastor created a stir. And it led to conversations. And gradually things can change, but they will only change to the extent that we actually try to put things into practice, not simply hold them as values in our minds.
All right, we've got a question from the Zoom audience.
The question is, what is next in your research on Charlotte or other women missionaries?
Well, as I indicated, we only recently discovered the location of the journal that she had written. We understand that there's also a box of letters that she had sent to her brother that presumably is still preserved by some relatives. So we're on the hunt for that. There are still potentially some more things that can be known about her. I also find myself being intrigued by other things that were part of the context in which she lived and worked. For instance, she's appointed in 1815. In that very year, there were 2 Baptist women preachers who were very well known. A Reverend Clarissa Danforth, who, as far as we can tell, is the first publicly licensed or ordained woman pastor in the state of New Hampshire, or in all of the United States. She had a very affirming community around her. She not only preached in her own church, she started other churches, she was invited to preach in other churches. She was described as, quote, the preaching sensation of the decade. That's 1815. At the same time, 1815, there was a book that was published containing the prayers and sermons of another Baptist woman preacher, Rachel Baker. This woman was unique because, number one, she wasn't ordained, but more importantly, she preached in her sleep. Reports of her preaching in her sleep appeared in newspapers as far away as Mississippi. Needless to say, some people thought, well, this has to be the work of the devil. Other people thought this woman is seriously ill. Other people didn't know what to make of it. Rachel would go to sleep, and about an hour later, she would begin preaching. And she preached full sermons. Neighbors began coming in to listen. Other people began coming in and as stenographers, writing down what she was saying. Local clergy would come in and interrupt her in her sleep and ask her questions. She would stop, she would answer their questions, and then pick up her sermon. She was brought to New York City so that she could receive the attention or the observation of medical examiners. And while there, it's rather intriguing. People would come to hear her preach at night. Medical people would come, but clergy would come. The medical people had questions about how she could preach when she was unconscious, when she was sleeping. The clergy had questions of how could she preach when she was a woman. So this is a life that I'm interested in doing more research about. Why did Edwin? Why would he do that to his sister? I really do not know. I really don't know. I'm trying to do some more research on Theophilus Ransom Gates to see what more I can learn. I mean, can I learn anything about the relationship that he had with Dr. Atlee? That is all more research yet to be done. Gates would end up publishing a total of 4 newspapers in Philadelphia. And the last one, by the time he was publishing his last one, he had identified a verse in the prophet Isaiah that said something like, "You are my battle axe." And he took that to be referring to himself, that he in some particular way was God's person to bring about change. He believed by that time that it was possible to gain perfection. And once one gained perfection, therefore there were no sins. He believed that by this time, that one should be freed from marriage contracts if that was not a fulfilling relationship. He had a number of followers who purchased farms west of Philadelphia in an area that predictably became called Love Valley, because members of one household could simply go into another household and say, God has told me that you and I should be together. So there are a lot of interesting things that were happening around that time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
We have.
Very good question. The question is, do we know who painted the portrait and when it was painted? The answer is no and no. Her brother Edwin and Edwin's wife Margaret both had their portraits painted by an early artist of that era named Bass Otis. It is possible that this same artist may be the person who painted this portrait of Charlotte, but there is nothing on that we've seen on the portrait itself that that indicates that. This is being preserved in the home of one of Charlotte's great nieces who lives in Alexandria, Virginia. It clearly was painted before 1815 when she sailed. I'm gathering she might be in her early 20s.
All right, we have a question from Zoom. Were there Baptist missionaries in the American quote unquote West in 1815? And if so, do you think Charlotte would have had the option to go west versus to India?
There were missionaries in the American West. In fact, after Charlotte's appointment, the next appointments of women were of single women who were appointed, this is by the Baptist Board, who were appointed as educational missionaries to teach in the Native American nations. So that could have been an option for her as well. I rather suspect that given her knowledge of William Carey through her associations in Haverhill, and then certainly her associations in Philadelphia, made her feel that that was a direction that she wanted to go. There also were a number of the British Baptist missionaries who had visited the United States on their way to India. They had been forced to do that because the East India Company didn't want any evangelical missionaries in India. Just as they didn't want children to be educated, they didn't want mission work being done because it might imperil their profits. So they banned any missionaries sailing on their ships. And since they had a monopoly, it meant you couldn't sail directly from England to India. You either had to wait and try to catch a ride on a ship from another nation coming through London on its way, or go to a third country and sail on a ship from that country. So a number of the British Baptist missionaries sailed first from England to the United States, and then secondarily found American ships going to India and sailed that way. So there were people who had known face-to-face individuals that were traveling to India to join William Carey. There were missionaries that had been working with William Carey that also made that trip to the United States on their way back to England. And so there was a lot of information about that particular connection.
Any final questions before we finish out? We got one more.
So what kind of training or preparation would missionaries like Charlotte and others during that time have before they went to serve?
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question. The fact is, there generally was none, because mission was in its, that is, modern mission was in its early years. So it wasn't as though you could go to a theological school and get a course or some training in working cross-culturally in mission. Much of it was what you learned by experience. And so that makes Charlotte's comments in her journal particularly important to notice. What things was she observing? What things was she experiencing? And how did that inform the way in which she engaged local Indian people? There was the opportunity to read the memoir of John Eliot, early missionary to Native Americans in the United States. There was an ability to read some of the travel records of other sailors to try to gain a little bit more knowledge about, another country in the other side of the world. Charlotte, for instance, in her journal, writes back to Edwin and describes to him this new fruit that she has found. It's rather delicious. It's called a banana. And she describes how you peel it from one end to the other, and then you eat the whole thing in one go. She describes how she's discovered this fruit called a pomegranate, and how it tastes and how you eat it. And this is all news to most people in the New World.
Any final thoughts before we head out? And Reid, do you have any final thoughts you want to conclude with?
Well, the final thing that I would want to say is that I think that Charlotte is a person who is worthy of being known. I think the fact that she was purposefully overlooked and purposefully omitted from the records really is an act of injustice. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so eager and happy to be able to help her life and her work to become known. It's a matter of justice.
And a great reminder that some of these stories are there to be uncovered or there to be recovered. They're not all just lost to history. They're not all just forgotten.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Stay tuned and we'll have a whole nother round of lectures and events coming up in 2023. And, please come back and enjoy Yuletide at Wheatland and some of the other holiday events we'll be having going on in the next couple weeks. Thank you so much.